Her name is Dr. Nathalie Cabrol. She's the director of the Carl Sagan Center at the SETI Institute right here in Northern California. And what she writes about life in the universe shattered everything I thought I knew about it.
How can we communicate with alien species? This is not a trivial thing.
We're going to talk a lot about alien life and why Earth might be a cosmic accident. We'll explore whether civilizations out there may stay silent on purpose and what it would take for humanity to survive its own future based on what we know about the deep secrets of the universe. But first, we have to ask perhaps the hardest question in all of science. Nathalie, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
I want to take this conversation in a very different place than I usually go because everybody thinks they know what alien life would look like. But your work really made me rethink our assumptions and then the assumption that we know what we're doing. I came out of it questioning whether or not we might be completely lost. And I want to ask you today about the biggest blind spots in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, how we might be missing alien life that's already here on Earth, and whether humanity itself is ready for first contact. And we'll get there soon. But first, I want to start with the most important, most uncomfortable question in all of science. Are you ready, Nathalie?
I'm all ready to go.
What is life?
We don't know. We don't know. That's the beauty of the whole thing, And then you have to wonder, how can you write 300 pages about something you don't know? Well, that's the whole thing. And I think that a lot of, what you said about, rethinking life and how we search for it, this is exactly it. I think we're coming at a time where we realize what we don't know, but we have a bunch of, data that has been coming from 40 years of planetary exploration right now. Maybe the most important thing is for us to rethink how we address those questions, how we ask them. And you will see as the discussion goes that really it's sometimes maybe only about re-articulating those questions.
Eventually, I want to get to what we might make of biosignatures that we're missing and how we might actually detect life beyond our imagination, or at least the limits of our imagination. But first, I want to ask you, in your vast expertise, what do you think is the most dangerous assumption that members of your community are making in the field of astrobiology? Which assumption has the most biases, whether intended to be prejudicial or not? What is the most dangerous aspect of the assumptions that are being made in your field?
I don't think we can say that any of them are dangerous, not in the sense that, the only danger is the intellectual danger, where you are sort of bottlenecking yourself. In fact, when we are honest with ourselves, we follow hypotheses and we develop experiments and we get more data, and then that forces us to rethink. So I don't think there's a danger. The bias is just that we are learning. And, the better our instruments are becoming, the more different the reality of the universe and how the universe looks for us, change. And this is what gives us the possibility of changing our perspective. It's not really a bias. It's just the way science works. That's the difference between science and science fiction. In science fiction, you have the answer to your question, in 200 pages or 2 hours of a movie. Science takes time. We have asked the question about, are we alone, for as long as we have looked, at the stars as a civilization. But today we are starting to have the amount of data and the perspective to bring the technology to this question. And this is becoming different. I wouldn't use the word danger or bias. Sometimes we can be a little biased, but it is a normal bias in the sense that we are going to look for life as we know it, because this is the only model that we know. This is where the bias is. But in the back of our mind, we know, already that there is a possibility that there is more than just that. We are doing with what we have right now. That doesn't mean that this is the only thing that we are contemplating.
You've explored some of the most extreme environments on Earth. In fact, you recently got back from there and caught some alien bug or something like that.
Yeah, in the middle of the desert, beat me.
I'm so grateful that you're spending time with us. And in these alien environments, even though they're right here on Earth, to me brings up what I call kind of two-path framework. Either life adapts easily everywhere, and the universe should be teeming with neighbors for us because we see life in these very places that you go and visit. Obviously, you wouldn't go there just to study some dead, desolate, non-existent, bioterrorist enclave. Or number two, Earth is an accident, an impossible cosmic fluke, and we might be utterly alone. And later, I'm going to ask you which path you think we're on. But first, I want to ask you, has being face to face with these extreme Earth environments made you feel more hopeful about life out there or more terrified for us here down on Earth?
There is no reason to be terrified by anything. I mean, yeah, maybe bugs sometimes, but it's all part of evolution, co-evolution, and adaptation there too, I guess. No, it makes me really hopeful because what you see, in fact, the simplest life form that we are finding in the Atacama Desert, because this is where I was, is really the story of species, microorganic species, that have been able to survive all the different epochs of Earth.
Yes.
And we know that they had many. We had times where the Earth was completely covered in ice, when it was mostly, an ocean world with very little continents. And then it was very hot, much hotter than it is today. And still, you find those bacteria that we're finding in the Atacama, they are very close to their ancestors who came about a little over 3 billion years ago. But what you see when you're studying them, in fact, is a time machine, because embedded in their metabolism, you see all the switches on and off about that condition and that condition. For instance, when they appeared on Earth, there was no ozone layer on our planet. So the Earth's surface was just like Mars today, bombarded by short UV, cosmic rays, etc., was not a very pleasant place to be. And so they started developing these adaptation mechanism, this coping mechanism. So that was for the UV, for the extreme UV. And then there was the cold, and then there was the salt, because when it's getting too hot on our planet, water evaporates, right? And the world becomes salty. And when you look at them, you see in them this Swiss Army knife of adaptation to all of these past times. These bacteria that we have today, they still have embedded in them the ability to fight against all of these different circumstances. And what is wonderful in the Atacama is this transect along the Atacama, the Altiplano, and the Andes, where you are going up high in altitude. Then the same bacteria in the Atacama have the switch on to fight against salt and UV radiation. The salt thing is much less active. The UV one is still there.
Right.
And in the Andes, forget about, the defense against salt. They don't need it. But the switch against UV is on, and not only during the day, but at night too. So you see in front of you what life can do on the planet.
I've had on many of your colleagues, ranging from Lisa Kaltenegger to Sarah Walker and others, and Paul Davies in particular, have made great contributions to looking for ways that we might be overlooking based on our, geoanthropomorphic bias and so forth. We'll talk about biosignatures and shadow biospheres later on, but many people seem to be asking, is there water? Is there carbon? Are those the essential things? And you've argued that true alien life might leave signals that have nothing to do with biology as we know it. And, Sarah's book, Life But Not As We Know It, will dovetail into this. But, later I want to ask you about something even more shocking, that alien life might be here, the shadow biosphere idea. But for people that have never heard an idea about this, what is an agnostic biosignature type of signature that you talk about? What is the weirdest thing that we might someday have to call alive, even if it's not life as we know it?
Well, actually, everything that you say, all the people, you missed a few,
Yeah,
but all the people that you talked about have something in common, and something that I think is really the new avenue we should be investigating for the search for life. As I said earlier on, it makes a lot of sense to be looking for carbon-based life and the type of life that we would recognize in water as a solvent for life, just because that's the most abundant stuff that you can find in the universe. It's not by accident that we are made of these bricks of life. And we also know, thanks to Kepler and TESS and James Webb and so many other ground space telescopes now, that There are many worlds out there only, in our Milky Way alone that are not identical to the Earth. It's impossible. Even within the universe, you cannot have two exact Earths. But you have environment where we know life as we know it, which doesn't mean necessarily us, but carbon-based life, needing energy, nutrients, shelters, etc., and water as a solvent, could still already survive in the universe. It's not stupid to think, but that's more going into the origins of life avenue, the one that we have been pursuing for the past few decades now. And this is where Sarah, Jeremy, and Paul Davis, Lisa, and myself, and others come along, Chris Campis, and say, that's fine, but as we do this, as we are looking for life as we know it, we are bottlenecking ourselves and limiting our view on what life can be. What I like about agnostic biosignatures, it's not in fact that it means that it's alien. No, not at all. Doesn't mean that it's alien. It means that it is a universal biosignature, which means that it's not connected to any biochemistries, something that life as a process will do no matter where it is and no matter what it is made of. I think that Jeremy England summarized this very clearly. Jeremy said, and he's pushed the envelope. Today, we don't know if he's right or wrong, but the way he thinks is certainly something that we need to pursue, which is to push back against, a little bit of all the hypotheses that we have been reading in the past few decades. Jeremy says, life is the inevitable result of thermodynamics. Boom. Because it's the best way to beat entropy. And then, and he has the modeling. His idea is not new. His idea comes from Schrödinger in 1942, biophysics. And why this is important? Because it doesn't look at life as a thing, which is the major issue that we're running into right now. If we're making life a thing, then there is the living and the non-living. And we all agree, or pretty much all of us agree now, that there is a transition between prebiotic chemistry and biology. But if it's a transition, where do you put the demarcation?
Right.
And it may not make any sense. So what Jeremy and others and Sarah and etc., they are pointing to a place where we don't need to worry about that. If we think of life as a process, a universal process, what are the agnostic, which means we don't care about the biochemistry.
Yeah.
What are the agnostic signatures that would allow me to recognize life in the universe anywhere and regardless of biochemistry? I think this is really, what is opening the field that's opening wide open right now. And I'm really looking forward to the next few years because it's going to be fantastic.
Well, Natalie, we have a tradition on this show, which is to do the unconventional, to do the impossible, which is to judge a book by its cover.
Hey, book lovers, we're judging books by their covers. We know we're not supposed to do it, but into the impossible, there's nothing to it. Let's take a look and judge some books.
This book is no different. I can read the back cover, the many encomia that you have, including one from Anne Druyan, and I want to, towards the end of the conversation, bring up perhaps a subject that you haven't been asked about that was brought to my attention by Anne Druyan when she was a guest on the podcast many years ago. But I want you first to take us through the cover. So the title, the subtitle, and the beautiful and majestic cover artwork. Would you do that for us, please?
Yeah, so The Secret Life of the Universe. In fact, this book is translated from the French, and in French, I chose something very different. The original title is Dawn of New Horizons. And the reason I chose that title was a play of words using the name of two planetary missions, the Dawn mission and the New Horizon missions.
Ah.
And those were two dwarf planets. And also the two missions in 2015 that actually blew our mind away and reset our thinking in astrobiology. Because when dawn got too serious, all of a sudden it started to lit up like it had lights on. Remember all the salt deposits and things like that? We
Right.
thought that alien had the light on when we came there. So all of a sudden we discovered that this tiny thing, which is, we still don't know, is it an asteroid still, or is it a dwarf planet? There's still this discussion going on, but might still have a residual ocean. So we don't know if life had any chance there, but certainly Ceres has the potential for habitability. That was March of 2015. Guess what happened in July of 2015? This supposedly dull, icy world so far away of the sun that there is nothing interesting in. All of a sudden, we discover Pluto,
Yep.
and boom, there too. Take that, astrobiology. And then not only we have a primordial ocean, but we also have convective systems that are creating those prisms, and at the surface we have ice volcanism, and we have rain down of organic material. So to me, 2015 was really a time that taught us that, there is maybe a lot more than meet the eyes when it comes to astrobiology. So that was my choice as a title for the French book. But I think that the American publishing company was a little concerned with the play of word, and maybe not, people not necessarily.
Right.
And then we came up with this one. We had a list of them. I don't remember the others. And that's actually the editor that, locked on this one. So the secret of the universe, I kind of like it
Yeah.
because it says a lot about astrobiology, all the things we don't know yet, and, everything that's happening already that we are really absolutely dreaming of discovering. So to me, that's the discovery, that's the mystery. This is what the title is about.
So what I love about it is that you are kind of a Schrodinger's cat superposition of astronomer and biologist. You're a real, true astrobiologist, and you're almost a field astrobiologist. Not that you go to other planets, although I suspect that you might be tempted into doing that someday. And later, I want to ask you what these different, discoveries that you've researched for your career, mean in terms of, whether or not we are looking in the right place. But first, I want to ask you, what evidence would convince you that a so-called shadow biosphere exists right here on our planet? So on page 45 of the wonderful book, you talk about, a shadow biosphere could be here if it's ambidextrous or a mirror image of ours. More important, how do we test the shadow biosphere hypothesis? Whether it exists or not, the pursuit of a shadow life on our planet will bring intellectual and technological advances that may put us on track to discover life beyond Earth, because it teaches us what it takes to recognize life as we don't know it. What is shadow biosphere?
There you nailed the scientific process. Nobody claims today that the shadow biosphere exists.
Right.
People who came up with this theory, or hypothesis if you prefer, Carol Leland and even Paul Davis, they talk about that. It's a thought experiment. Let's go back on our planet at the time of life is emerging. It probably was a difficult process because, as you know, our neighborhood was not really friendly at the time. We were taking mountain-sized asteroids and comets. They were literally raining down, which means that, these worlds were impacting ours. Everything that was built at some point was just destroyed the next day. We kind of agree that the life as we know it here on Earth probably had a few start before it could anchor itself. And it probably also didn't happen in one place. There is an emerging theory today, which I like, is just because it goes very well with this idea of life being a process, another thing, which would say that life started to emerge on Earth pretty much everywhere, in all the places where it could, where, this was feasible. So, but let's assume that's the case. We know today that the life we know goes back to the one common ancestor that we call Luca.
Common ancestor, right? Last human ancestor.
Common ancestor, and goes back to the one ancestor there. We know the tree of life goes back there. So the idea of the shadow biosphere is that at the time where the Luca tree of life was being put into place, then there might have been other trees of life emerging as well. They were probably based on the same thing because this is the same planet, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, etc. But it would take only for this life to have a different number of amino acids, for the geometry of their molecules to be different, for us not to be able to recognize them in our tests, because our tests are all tuned toward the type of life we know. It's not extraterrestrial life, it's not alien life, it's terrestrial life, but with the potential for us not to be able to know that it's here. So obviously, it didn't lead to super civilization, to high technology, etc. But there might be microorganisms, bacteria, who knows, we just don't acknowledge as being life, or we don't even see, or we don't recognize as being life just because of that. I would guess that viruses are some good candidates to that. I think that there was a paper last week that says that they discovered something. It needs to be obviously verified, but they find something that looks like life but doesn't map against the tree of life that we know. So I don't know if the shadow biosphere is true or false. It doesn't matter. What matters is the intellectual process it forces us into to think about how do we search for life we don't know.
And so you brought up some of my favorite topics here, including asteroids raining down. I just want to point out that I do give away these possible incubators or delivery seed packages called meteorites that may have delivered life here through what's called panspermia, which you talk about in the book. I give them away to people randomly who join up on my mailing list at briankeating.com/list. You can join up there, and I'll be writing about this episode and all the wonderful learnings from it, and have some cool AI secret research that I'll get from the transcript that I will provide to my listeners. So make sure you sign up for that. And I want to pivot now to the SETI Institute and what you do there and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. You are the Sagan director, and I, of course, have my Carl Sagan finger puppet,
Our CEO as one of those two.
Yes, exactly. So I gave one to Elisa, and I'll give one to you when we meet in person finally. Now, SETI has captured the public imagination for decades for a variety of reasons, both the subject matter and some of the technology. SETI at home was one of the first, if not the first, real citizen science, massive computing clusters, distributed computing back in the late 90s. Phenomenal
It
project.
came out of Berkeley, actually, not of the SETI Institute. But
Okay.
of course, Berkeley and the SETI Institute collaborate with each other. But
That's
that's out of Berkeley.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you for the correction. Now, you've called out something, deeply uncomfortable, in my opinion, that are search strategies that we use, that SETI uses. And I've had on, recently had on Shelley Wright, who's my colleague. I'm blessed to have her here, winner of the Drake Medal not too long ago. And we talked about search strategies. Just one example that she discussed that illuminated, no pun intended, well, pun intended. I'm a dad, so I get entitled to dad jokes, Natalie, but illuminated by laser light. In other words, we've been looking for radio waves because that was the easiest technology to look for. But her mentor, and friend Charlie Towns, inventor of the laser, suggested in the 1970s or so that actually one of the most promising ways would be to look for laser pulses. And then here at UC San Diego, the late, great Franklin Antonio helped to fund a lot of the research projects that are going on, both in what she was doing and what you guys are doing. So I want to ask you the question, are we looking, where the light is? There's an old joke about a guy who's drunk. A policeman sees him. He's looking underneath the light post. He says, "What are you doing here? I lost my keys." And they search together for an hour. And then the policeman, "Are you sure you lost them here?" And he says, "No, that's where the light is. So I'm looking here." What is the single biggest possible systematic error, as we scientists might say, when we search for alien civilizations? Is it a error in theoretical modeling? Is it some background, noise that we might get either in the radio search, the optical search, the biosignature search? What is the biggest source of systematic error, whether biological, astrophysical, or cognitive, that we are making, perhaps?
Again, I will say the same thing that I said when we had this discussion a few minutes ago about astrobiology. These are not errors. You have to go for the things you know. For it's very hard to fathom something you don't. You have to start somewhere. That's the beginning of our journey, So, yeah, we could try to imagine all sorts of things, but it's a wild goose chase because we don't know what they can look like if they don't look like us, You have to, so just like for astrobiology, it might not be the only thing, but it makes sense to search for these things too. we cannot ignore them. Just because we understand them, we should not ignore them. That would be, to me, that would be the error. But having said that, I would agree with you that the chances for alien to be similar to us is 0. And the reason I'm saying this is because every single life is the product of the coevolution, the biological evolution, and its environment. And so this coevolution is going to be completely different from one word to another. It might have similarities. So the coevolution is different. And why does this matter? Because, well, Ryan, this neural box that we have here is the product of 4 billion years of adaptation on this word. And the neural box or the brain or whatever alien have to think is going to be the product of their coevolution. If they reach the point where they are a technologically advanced civilization, we will share things. And this is where we need to go, the sharing. What they are going to share if they survive that long is the curiosity. That's the technology, the ability to look outward and ask questions that are bigger than the day-to-day survival mode, like humans have been for a long time. We have been the prey for a long time until we were able to protect ourselves and techno-environment that we live in. But at the same time, that opened a range of different questions and a range of different possibilities for us. So there will be some overlap, and we need to think in terms of overlap. So yes, the overlap, the thing we share for sure, is the universe we are in. We share the same universe, at least for this one. I don't know if there are multiple ones around.
I'm working on that. Leave that to me, Nathalie.
Yeah, I love the idea. In this universe, we share the same laws, physics laws. We share the same, rules that we need to abide from. So it makes sense to start with that. We are not disrupting any physical laws. We are looking in the radio because we think that maybe they want to. Radio is nice. It goes through dust. It goes through a lot of stuff. This is very convenient. And laser, as you say, this is the other thing. Traveling at the speed of light, this is as fast as we can go, at least as far as we know. And this is why the SETI Institute now has, laser SETI. We are developing this network of camera looking up too. But there is something else. And this is something that I didn't even talk about so much in the book. The only thing that I mentioned in the book is that I am not too much of a fan of the Fermi paradox. I think it's a great way to start a conversation. Because if you want to speak of biases, the whole Fermi paradox is really a psychological, deep dive into human brains and how human would interact or the fears that human may have. But it asks the very wrong question. The question is not about where are they? The question is about what are they? Because if now you are thinking in terms of life, okay, so look at where we are right now. We are a civilization that's getting to a point where, it's escaping its planet. It's capable of exploring space, not in many, revolutionary ways. We are not able to travel at the speed of light. We are not, our fastest spacecraft is really the Parker Solar Probe. It's going really fast, but it would take still thousands and thousands of years to get toward the closest star. Our neighbor 4 light years away. What I'm trying to say here is that we are at the point where we are discovering all these toys, we're discovering our universe, how we measure to it. And we are also at this point where we are developing an intelligence that little by little is becoming at least as smart as we are, maybe one day become smarter than we are, is already faster than we are to think. I'm talking about AI here. And what I'm saying is that traveling in space for organic bodies is dangerous. It exposes you to illnesses. Let's face it, we are fragile. We're fragile. We are robots. And AI, they aren't. And so it may just be that right now we are looking for an organic conversation when maybe, very advanced civilization have sent an army of robots and AI throughout the universe, and maybe it's not in their plan right now to just get a conversation with us.
That's right.
I'm having all of these scenarios in my head. What if, our AI meet their AI? Tell me about the first contact. That should be very interesting. But I think, again, for SETI, as for astrobiology, it is time to revisit the way we question the universe, the way we address the major questions of astrobiology, because the SETI search is part of astrobiology. It's search for extraterrestrial advanced civilization. They are life until we prove that they are AI, but this is something else. They are a second generation at that point. So that's what I'm saying. It's not necessarily because there isn't anybody out there. As Carl said, that would be such a huge waste of space. It's just that, well, there are a number of possibilities. The first one, I think, is an interesting one, is that maybe life, as we understand it, that doesn't mean as we know it, but as we understand it, an assemblage of molecule, etc., is a generational thing.
What does that mean?
The universe.
What do you
Which
mean?
means that when the universe was born, we see James Webb has been showing us the presence of organic molecule already there, like 2.5 billion years ago. That was a big reveal 2 years ago when it was, the fact that we have so many mature galaxies so early, just barely a few 100 million years after the Big Bang. So that raised a number of questions. But it's not so much the presence of all those things. I think it's more of the abundance of all those things. Maybe the universe is getting to a point, or was getting to a point like 5 billion years ago when our sun was born, or when the stars like our sun were born, 10 billion years ago, where these elements became abundant enough that they could be used in a way that would lead to the process of life. And if that's the case, then life and civilization are just emerging right now in the universe. And we might be all young and trying to figure out, maybe we have neighbors right next to us, maybe just out or within our radio bubble, and we don't know that we are there. I really like the example of the little brother or sister of the sun. Stars, as we know, are born in nurseries, multiple stars. And so a few years ago, astronomers have discovered a star that matches our sun in terms of its spectra, its identity, its composition, etc. So they are fairly confident that it was born in the same nursery than the star. It's about the same age and has been moving away, like the sun has been, taking its journey into the universe. Happens so that this particular star is now just at the limit of our radio bubble.
Yes.
So now I am going to make this completely outrageous speculation. But let's just, for the sake of it, let's just assume that for some totally weird and improbable reason, you have people looking and thinking like us on a planetary system around that star, and they're about as old as we are. And the about is really important here, because if you just go 200 years ago, the fastest way for us to go from point A to point B was the fastest horse, right? See how it is important here, synchronicity in time and space, in the way that we're searching. But let's assume that they made it, they have the technology, but they are just outside our radio bubble. We might touch and we might overlap within the next 20 years, but right now we are right next to each other and we don't know that we are right next to each other. This is not that that space is empty. It's maybe that we are not connecting yet. And imagine, like, if life is really a generational aspect of the universe, imagine all of a sudden in, say, a few decades or maybe 100 years from now, all of a sudden these bubbles are touching and the sky all of a sudden, becomes just a Christmas tree lit of civilization talking to each other. That's a scenario, right? That's one. The other one is, everything you want to read about the Fermi paradox. They are hiding because it's a dog dog's universe and, you don't want to be found. It's a very human, get out of the jungle kind of weird, but it's in our brains. So that's the dark forest and so on and so forth. There is the zoo. We are not, evolved or intelligent enough. They are looking at us. They are letting us making our decisions. They don't want to intervene. They will show up when we are grown up. We can say whatever we want. The end member hypothesis is the rare earth hypothesis.
Yeah.
And this one, I took a stab at it in the book. Because as a scientist, yes, it's an hypothesis. And as long as I cannot falsify this idea, it's still out there.
Yeah.
There is still a probability that we are alone. As probable as it looks, it could be, as long as I cannot prove that it's not the case, it's still out there.
It should be the baseline null hypothesis, right?
Exactly. The problem with that, the rare earth hypothesis, is that the equation that they try to mirror with Frank's equation, the Drake equation, but the problem with that equation, they said that they were bringing in all the information we didn't have that, when Frank created the equation. But the issue is that in building this equation, they actually input everything that makes Earth the Earth.
It was biased, yes.
Very surprising that at the end of the equation, what comes out, it's the Earth. And I can agree with them on this, that you could have exactly the same ingredient, exactly at the same time in the universe, exactly at the same place, with everything being the same, but just send that planet on its orbit a millionth of a second before the other. Just because of that, the timing of extinction would be different. The timing of impact and collision with comets and asteroids would be different. Everything will turn out different.
Exactly.
So yeah, you cannot have two Earths in the universe, and there are trillions and trillions of galaxies, each of them containing billions and billions of stars.
Yeah. And I've heard that argument from Adam Frank, that basically it's the Carl Sagan argument, but made quantitatively accurate by saying, how many stars have there been and planets have there been in the history of the observable universe? But of course, that's a sphere with a diameter of 90 billion light years, and it's lasting going back 13.8 billion years. So of course, you're going to find a very low probability that Earth is the only example of life whatsoever, and then certainly technological life. And then your colleague Jill Tarter, who's been on the show before, she'll say things, well, we've only searched the equivalent of a bathtub out of the Pacific Ocean, to which I replied to her, well, if we did search and we found no microbes inside of that bathtub and no life whatsoever, it still puts a limit on how
I would push back on this argument
Uh-huh.
for one reason. And the reason being that you're saying, we haven't found anything. But the thing is that we are only starting to search. And there is this myth in people's mind that we have been searching for life forever. That's not true. The only effort that was made to searching for life on Mars was in 1976. That was the Viking experiment.
Right.
And you know what happened there? And that's the reason why we didn't search for life for another 50 years. Well, even more than that.
Yeah.
Just because we couldn't tell the responses that we have, the data, which by the way was very ambiguous about
Right.
life, no life, and people are still arguing today. The reason being that we didn't know the Martian environment, and therefore we had nothing to subtract the signal that we are seeing from that environment.
Exactly.
And so this is when we decided to have an integrated program that would tell us everything we need to know about the Martian environment, about the Martian climate, past and present, and then send two rovers here an opportunity to check for habitability. We demonstrated that. And then Curiosity was Spirit and Opportunity on steroid. We wanted to learn more. We had the evidence that Mars was habitable for life as we know it a long time ago. So we had that evidence. And now, in 2018, we sent Perseverance. And Perseverance, although it says that it's searching for life, is actually still very much a habitability kind of mission. But now what it's trying to do is to cache some samples that are going to tell us a lot more about, the possibility for long-organic molecule to assemble. And by the way, look what happened last week. We found this very, very long chain of molecules on Mars. So this is where I push back. I haven't searched for life in a solar system or in the universe for a long time.
Yeah.
Just starting, Brian. We are just starting. So it is not only incorrect, but it would be very unwise for us to say that there is no life out there.
All right.
Because
So
just
yeah,
starting to have the knowledge to search for it where it should be.
this is going to be controversial. Some argue that we should be sort of announcing to the universe, because it might be our best chance to survive, that we exist, that we should be, sending out invitations to what some call, including the late great Stephen Hawking, warned us that it might be ringing a dinner bell, for other, catastrophic invasions of the planet itself. And later I'm going to ask you about an even wilder idea that life might exist without planets at all. But first I want to ask you about the messaging of extraterrestrial intelligence and an actual image that Carl Sagan, again, was instrumental in putting on the Voyager and Pioneer probes. It's a plaque that shows not only what men and women look like, and I wonder if he could get that done nowadays, if that would be controversial or politically incorrect, but we'll leave that aside. And then he mapped out where we are and he put a hydrogen atom there. And I actually talked to Andrurian because I used to ask guests what they'd put on a time machine that could last for 1 billion years. And she said, "Oh, I did that. Carl put my brainwaves on it on the disc after we started falling in love. So she already did that. That will last 1 billion years." But my question to you related to this, do you think that humanity should stop broadcasting our location out into the universe?
This is so deliciously human, Brian. This really makes me smile every single time I am being asked this question. And this is the thing, too, that always stopped me, because you have these incredible geniuses, bright mind, like Stephen Hawking. And all of a sudden, they have these little boys' fears about, oh my God, we shouldn't be broadcasting because the big bad wolf out there is going to come and eat us. And of all people, you should know that we have been broadcasting. Whether you want it or not, we have been broadcasting. This is the radio bubble I'm talking about. It's about 200 light year, 240 light year in diameter around us. It's not waiting for us to message anything. It's pretty clear if, somebody is watching and really wanted us, had some bad ideas about us, they would be here already. So I have no fear about that. For me, it's not fear-based. It's not fear-based because every single day in our life, we are emitting. And if you really have alien civilization that is more advanced than we are, they know we are here. And if they are not showing up, they have a reason. Maybe they don't care. Maybe they just don't. And maybe we go through the Fermi paradox once again. Or maybe there is this generational aspect of life in the universe that comes into play as well. But I think that there again, it's just like everything else. You cannot really get rid of it. This fear base is in our brain, and it's
a part of evolution.
It's part of evolution. It's our safeguard. It's what allowed us to be here, and to avoid getting in trouble. It's the fear base of saying maybe somebody is watching me beyond that rock, or something like a big cat or a bear. So today, this translated into aliens. Aliens might not be so good after all. And we can blame ourselves for that, because I think that a lot of the science fiction does a lot to do with that. When you're looking at Alien or when you're looking at V or all these things, they are not very friendly.
No.
But this is really our psyche here,
Yeah.
more than anything else. So to go back to the question itself, there are two ways so far of doing SETI. I mean, two domains. One is the passive listening and watching.
Yeah.
Which is, we listen with big antenna. These are the radio telescopes. And we are watching with the camera, that's laser SETI. We are watching for messages. And there is METI. METI is the active part of SETI. The SETI Institute doesn't do that. What they are trying to figure out, which I think is really interesting, trying to figure out, how can we communicate with alien species? And this is not a trivial thing. In 2018, I organized a workshop at the SETI Institute that was entitled Decoding Alien Intelligence. And I brought together people from many different disciplines. Of course, you had the usual suspect, Paul Davis and Lawrence Doyle, and, and people that are related in one way or another.
Yes.
With intelligence, consciousness, and SETI. But I also contacted someone that nobody saw it coming. And not even her. Many years ago, I read a book that got stuck in my, in my mind. One of these books that you read 12 times, this book by Roger Fouts, that's called Next of Kin. And it's about his history and his meeting with chimpanzees and his career, helping them, basically protecting them. He was not meant at all to do that. This is not what he wanted to do. He wanted to be a psychologist and help people with autism, children with autism. And, but he was without a penny. He was about to get married and he was looking for a job, a summer job. And there was this last thing, this job at a lab for a professor to help him just take care of the chimpanzees. So he went there, had a 5-10 minutes interview with the professor in question, and very quickly understood that he wouldn't make the cut. The professor was very polite and actually walked him back to his car. Just before he got to his car, it was this little black dot, coming bigger and bigger. And all of a sudden, he has this baby chimpanzee jump at his neck and grab him by the neck and just cuddle. And the professor in question looked at him and said, well, apparently you have something with chimpanzee. So he hired him. And that chimpanzee, her name was Washu. And she changed his life. They were not speaking English to this chimpanzee. They were doing American Sign Language. He recreated the journey about the discovery of language through these apes. I mean, I recommend that book to anybody who's thinking this question, because to me, that was such a reveal, and also showing how complicated it can be to communicate with our next of kin. They have shared
96%
of evolution.
and our genetics.
98% of our DNA.
Yes.
And it's not that easy. There are very, delicious scenes in that book when they have, a couple of the female chimpanzees in the living room with catalogs, men's fashion catalogs, and they are assigning to each other that they find the guy cute. And one of these female teaching her baby the sign language. These are different things. So I tried to contact Roger Fouts. I sent an email and I received a note that he was retired. I connected with the person who replaced him, Nathalie Cabrol, and when we met the first time on the telecon, for me to tell her what I wanted from her, we had the best time of our life, because for the first 10 minutes, we couldn't stop laughing. She looked at me and she said, Nathalie, I was really wondering what the director of the Carl Sagan Center at the SETI Institute really wanted from the director of the Primate Center. Let me explain. And Marilee just nailed it. And explained, how come we are sharing this space, sharing this coevolution with each other. And yet it's so hard to communicate with anything or anybody in our biosphere.
Even human beings, right? I mean, we don't understand each other and we're 100% similar, right?
And there is culture and there is other thing, coming on top of each other. So you have to start from that base. All of this needs to be considered when you are thinking about extraterrestrial intelligence. I don't think that the messaging is going, is such a big issue whatsoever. If it had to be an issue, we would know it. And by the way, why would extraterrestrial just wait now? Like, we are starting to be able to maybe a little bit being able to defend ourselves. We lived in caves with spears and arrows. For God's sakes, if they wanted to take the place over, they are 10,000 years late.
Right. Yes,
So-
now we have TikTok to fend them off.
Oh, well,
That's our only hope,
So
Natalie.
maybe here's an example of why maybe they don't want to show up here. Jokes aside, this is a very complex question. And the METI, this is not what the SETI Institute does.
Right.
But I understand that it is extremely important for us to understand, what language means, how language evolves, how do we communicate, as you mentioned so rightfully. This will help us first and foremost on our planet to start with. And then you have people like Lawrence Doyle, who is trying to understand how we can communicate with other intelligent species. When it comes back to the basics, we are sharing the same planet, and it's not ours to use as a playground just for the sake of it.
Absolutely.
And if we can communicate with whales, with dolphins, with others, these are the obvious, but Lawrence will show you that every species that we consider intelligence, like ants and bees and, others, we have the same syntax.
I have two final questions for you, and this has been so generous of you. I can only send you 1,000 merci beaucoup in my primitive high school French that I got.
See, that's an attempt at communication.
Exactly. I remember the first time I went to Paris, I was a new graduate student. I wanted to see it. I was visiting from London. Took the Channel Tunnel, got across there. I'm like, I'm gonna be okay. I took 3 years of high school French, and I get off the metro, get the Gare du Nord, and get out and go into the streets, and I see this little boy, and he's playing with his dog, and I see him, he's talking to the dog. He's allons-y, and blah, blah, blah. He's talking to I'm like, that dog knows 10 times as much French as I know and will ever know. So I just gave it up, and I figured, why deny the Parisians the pleasure of, correcting an American's bad French and just speak to them in
No, you shouldn't have any complex about this.
No, I don't.
You know,
I love
the French and the American have exactly the same superiority complex.
That's
Let
right.
me explain to you.
And I'm a New Yorker, so I'd like
The
even
American
more.
people think that they don't need to learn any other language because everybody speaks English, right?
Right. That's right.
And the French, well, at least the past generation, this is much less true with the new generation. But they thought that they were speaking the most beautiful language in the world. So there was no need to learn any other language.
Yeah.
So no worries. No, actually, I've been going back to France from time to time. And the first time was after 17 years of not being there. So
Wow.
I discovered a newest generation was more keen to, speak foreign languages, more welcoming. So to me, that was good. It felt really good.
Well, I have these two final questions.
Yeah.
The first one is about the meaning of discovery of plausible evidence for extraterrestrial life. And it reminds me of a scene from the movie Contact, which is based on the book by Andrew Ian and Carl Sagan, of course. And it's a wonderful movie and partially based on our friend Jill Tarter's life at some level. And that is the scene in which they have real footage of President Bill Clinton, and he's speaking on the White House lawn. And it's a true thing. It actually occurred.
Oh, yeah, that was the Mars meteorite.
Right. And so there was a meteorite. So here's a meteorite. Again, you can get at briankeating.com/list. Although if you have a .edu email address and you live in the United States, you're guaranteed to get one of these. And that's at briankeating.com/edu. But they found a meteorite, and I'm always told that it would be the greatest discovery of all time. So first of all, that discovery was never confirmed, but it never was really fully excluded at, say 10 sigma. It's kind of ambiguous still to this very day, which made me think the general public, to the extent that they know anything about this event, was probably left with the impression that was on the front page of the New York Times and, for days, and in this press conference held on the White House lawn and later in the movie Contact, that this actually occurred. And, we don't know. Maybe it is extraterrestrial life. And yet, Nathalie, we still treat people rather horribly, as you and I can admit. So it hasn't really changed the way that humans look at each other. What do you make of this kind of ambiguity? And this, I always hear that, oh, it's going to change everything. It changed nothing as far as I can tell. And
Well,
it's not real. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
you're touching on a very sensitive point here. First, for the Martian meteorite, Dave McKay was a good friend of mine. Actually, I shared some of my samples from the Andes with him because he was trying to understand, what he was seeing. And what happened during the whole episode is some of the best example of what science debate should be.
Yeah.
Because David's team and the opposing team, if you prefer,
Yeah.
were just respectful of each other. They respected each other very much. It became a show every single year at the Lunar and Planetary Science Conference. We're expecting the new evidence, the new thing, because obviously David was presenting some evidence and the other team was countering with other evidence saying you can explain this and that. I personally, being a geologist by background, I disagreed with David, but we had this discussion. I said, David, this looks to me more like a pattern of a geological origin. And also there is no need for a Martian bacteria necessarily at first to be a bacteria and to look like a terrestrial bacteria,
Right.
So all these discussions were going on at the time. So now why it didn't have any impact? And by the way, the sequence that was taken for Clinton was used in the movie to actually confirm a much bigger event, which was the discovery of an alien civilization. But let me tell you something. First, there is the fact that the reaction of the public, I strongly believe, from the public, will be very different if we find microbial life than if we found an extraterrestrial civilization. Because maybe, it is the view of the general public that, well, yeah, that's great. That means that there is life elsewhere. But, I really like to talk to an alien, would like to share
Right.
emotions. I would like aliens to tell me about their planet and their philosophy. And, did they ever get to religion? Is this part of evolution, or is just, whatever, science, technology? So this is probably why on the general public, the discovery of microbial life would have less effect than alien life. On the other hand, the public should understand something, is that we live in a very statistical universe, which means that the more microbial life we find, the greater the chance we have to find an extraterrestrial civilization. So that would be great news, and not only for microbes, but also for the other guys. If it was Mars, or if it was our solar system, wherever it is, that would be also noting that you have now found life on 2 planets out of 8. It's 25% right away. That tells us something about what's, the ability of life to survive in the universe. And there is something as well, is that it might be, a little remote for the general public, but microbes can talk. And I'm not talking about speech here.
No, they communicate.
Metabolism, where, what makes them. Everything tells us about the planet they are coming from. Obviously, we would find them on the planet, but also what they went through. Just like the bacteria we're talking, at the very beginning.
Right.
They have embedded in them the history of their evolution. They are literally, planetary journeys trapped in a small body. Of course, you have to speak the language, and this is what puts a little separation between the general public and people capable of reading the microbes, but the discovery would be equally important. Of course, the extraterrestrial discovery would be on another level. So how did you make it? Because right now, we are trying to figure out as human, I am not looking at finding extraterrestrial to help us find solutions. We need to find our solutions ourselves on our world. We need to be better humans and better top of the biosphere. We need to take care of our planet, all the beings, all of them that are living on them, and we need to take care of each other. But it would be important for us to see, at least for me, to try and understand what an alien civilization went through. Did they meet the same challenges? Are they at each other's throat, or is this a trait that is typical of apes? We know that a number of apes are not aggressive, but many are. So maybe it's a trait that we're carrying from the time, we're still living in the forest.
That's right.
I'd like to ask so many questions, especially, in terms of spirituality, asking if religion is just a moment in evolution. When we just discover this big universe, your mind is discovering that there is a big universe around you, but you have no way of explaining it. So all of a sudden you create gods and you create religions to try to make sense. This is the same thing, science and religion, where science is trying to measure nature, to understand it. And religion, spirituality, they are trying to explain what cannot be measured. And it's this attempt for us to find our place here. I'd like to have this discussion saying, do you think that religion is this moment when we realize that there is a big universe and we have to create something to make sense of it and feel safe in it, but it's just a passage? Or is it really that we evolve and all of a sudden our mind becomes open to the possibility of something greater than us? I am not a religious person, but I'm open because I think this is another way to getting access to the world that's around us, the universe that's around us. And each human should be entitled to, express this connection in the way they desire. This kind of question for me, the hoops and loops and, how did you get there? How did you make it?
It's wonderful. And in the book, just to conclude, you described humanity as being in a sort of chrysalis, one that's unfinished, evolving, dangerous. Remind me of my wife bought some butterflies in chrysalis form, monarch butterflies for my kids a couple of years ago. And she was like so fascinated with these things. They sit there, they just look like they're a dried piece of wood, which they're camouflaged to look that way to avoid predators, I suppose. And they've evolved that way. And then over a course of a couple of days, you don't do anything. You don't water it, you don't feed it, you just keep it away from one of my kids who's very dangerous. And then eventually they start to wiggle and then they start to chew. And then all of a sudden you see this thing and then it flies. And I don't necessarily believe in miracles, as a religious type of miracles, but it's as close to a miracle as you can possibly witness. I mean, you can't witness a human fetus, it being conceived and then coming out of an egg and divide. You can't witness it, and the kid live, but it does seem sort of remarkable. And I want to ask you, as we wrap up, are we worth saving? What is our best hope and the greatest lesson that we could be left with of all, in your opinion?
Of course we are. And it's important that we will be, but what you're describing, the butterfly, which is actually the cover of my next book that came out in January in French, is that what's happening right now is not so surprising. I think it's part of the growing pains. This transformation from the chrysalid to the butterfly is not easy.
No.
It's painful. It's hard. And on top of that, there are the pains we create for each other that don't help. This is why the overview effect is so important. And we are at this threshold. This is what planetary exploration, what astrobiology brings back, which is this mirror effect. That in fact, you are starting from the Earth, you are looking, outward in the universe to ask those questions. And because we are the only model of life we know, all the questions we ask are in fact a reflection of the answer we would like to have for ourselves. So basically, we are learning about ourselves by looking outward, and then we're bringing those questions back here. So what's happening right now is that we are still hanging for dear life to this primordial brain that really think that we should be afraid of the dark forest, that we should be afraid of the alien, and the alien so convenient in English because the alien can be the extraterrestrial, but it can be the neighbor that doesn't look like you, that doesn't speak the same language, that doesn't have the same religion, spiritual belief, or none of them. Right now, we're still stuck here because being wary is what allowed us to survive. But hey, something happened. One picture happened, which is the view of our Earth from space. And from space, when you're looking at this blue planet, this is the color of all of us. We are all blue. Because from there, as Carl said, the clouds don't know any frontiers. There is no geopolitics from space. The atmosphere is moving freely. The oceans are going about their business. And this is the image that we need to embody. This is the picture that we need to keep in mind. This is the only way humanity is going to survive, that becoming one. The fear for people when we say that, they say, oh, well, you're a globalist and we are all going to lose whatever.
Gaia, right.
No, absolutely not. What you have here, the color of people's skin, the way they speak, what they look like is the product of environment, time, and history. We are the same.
Yeah.
It's just that we are an example of the wonderful biodiversity that life and Earth is capable of creating.
Yeah.
And what is very funny somehow, or ironic, I would say, rather than funny, and I took that example somewhere else, is in 1980, I happened to be a soccer fan, what you call soccer, that in France we call football. And in 1998, the French were world champion for the first time.
That's right.
France has a different form of racism, But it exists, and of course, like anybody else, when something goes wrong, it's always the fault of the guy that doesn't look like you. So in 1998, the French team is composed of all the prism you can imagine, all the colors, all the body shape, all the religions or lack thereof. You have 11 guys running on the field. The metaphor here is fun because they, of course, are wearing a blue shirt. They're the French blue. And they are becoming world champion game after game. And in the stand, they're all French all of a sudden. All of these people, they are not blonde and blue-eyed, which was the archetypical French
Gallic, right?
100 years ago, which that's true now. But people don't care.
No.
They are French. They are rooting for them, So why aren't we able to do that for our planet? These supporters at that time, and I don't know what happened after the World Championship, but why can we see the goal and that we are all rooting for a goal, in those instances and not realize they didn't think that they were losing anything by supporting that team. They were embracing them. We can do the same for our planet. We are not losing our identity. We are bringing our identity as added strength to the team Earth. And this is what should be happening. That's my soccer metaphor. Ultimately, we are tiny. Well, you said, just like you, I don't like miracles. But when you think about the odds of us being on that rock, launched so fast in a universe so big, and actually at each other's throat, that doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't. But hopefully it won't be universal. And I really think this is the greatest lesson that, I took from the book, that the search for alien life is searching for who we are and who we want to become. As you said earlier, it's not, where are they, but what are they? And that includes the full panoply of their existence. Because, if life does exist out there, it might be unrecognizable, but we know for sure that life exists down here, and it's fragile and it's messy and it's beautiful. And the real question is not whether we're alone, as you say, but whether we're ready. And I think this is the greatest lesson of all. And I think for my audience out there, I enjoy this conversation so much. And if you want to understand how rare life may be and what we can do about it and what it means for our future as human beings on Earth, Nathalie breaks it down fully in this wonderful book, which is over a year old. I've been trying to get you on for all that time via every mode of communication possible. I was sending Medi
August of last year, so it's not quite a year old.
Yeah, almost a year old. Get The Secret Life of the Universe and follow up with some of the great episodes I've done with Nathalie's colleagues, from Shelley Wright to Jill Tarter to Sarah. Why do you think so many women, so many wonderful, brilliant women are attracted to this field? Do you have any idea why?
I don't believe that there are more women in astrobiology than any other science. While it's getting better, or it was getting better, maybe they are more vocal. Or maybe they bring, I'm not going to say that guys are not passionate about what they're saying, because they have tons of evidence, of wonderful men colleagues who are as passionate. But maybe we see them more, or the public think that they are more visible because of the subject itself. Maybe the subject is also creating the aura against, the backdrop of all of this.
Natalie, I want to thank you so much, and remind people, if you want to get some extraterrestrial material, some possibly technology, according to some, I'm not giving this away, but I will give away meteorites. Go to briankeating.com/YouTube and get The Secret Life of the Universe. It should not be a secret. And I can't wait to have you on for the next book. That just sounds wonderful. So hopefully that'll take less than 9.5 months to organize and get together. Now, thank you so much. Bon weekend. Bon weekend.
Having me.
Merci beaucoup.
Il n'y a pas de quoi.